Welcome to the fourth episode of the In Conversation Roundtable discussion, Trees, Climate Change and Health. My name is Carmel Williams and I'm Director of the Centre for Health and Policies Research Translation and the Founding Director of the World Health Organization Collaborating Centre for Health and Policies Implementation. Before we begin today's session, I would like to provide an acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Centre for Health and Policies Research Translation and the Healthy Environment and Lives Network acknowledges the traditional custodians of country all throughout the world and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to the elders past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and Indigenous people around the globe today. It's really a pleasure to have you all here today and to be able to be talking about trees, climate change and health. But perhaps it would be helpful to just explain a little bit more about the In Conversation Roundtable series. The Centre for Health and Policies Research Translation has worked with Evelyn Deleu, Professor of Urban Health and Policy, to develop and deliver the In Conversation Boundary Spanners, Thinkers and Policy Actors series, to raise the profile of topical and challenging societal problems and their potential solutions, with the aim of helping to progress understanding across research, policy and practice communities, and to assist in moving each of these issues forward through increased collaborative and thoughtful action. Today's fourth episode of the series, we have partnered with the Healthy Environment and Lives Network, HEAL. The HEAL network aims to catalyse research, knowledge exchange and translation into policy and practice that will bring measurable improvements to our health, the Australian health system and to the environment. We're very privileged to have a range of esteemed expert speakers joining us today to lead our discussion, and I'll introduce each of them to you shortly. Before we start today's session though, I'd really like to invite my wonderful colleague from our partner agency, the HEAL Network, to introduce himself. Over to you, Sotiris.
Thank you very much, Carmel. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning. It's my pleasure to be in this webinar, and I represent the HEAL Network, which is a large coalition of investigators and organizations and stakeholders from across Australia working on healthy environments and lives. I'm the director of the HEAL Network and Professor of Global Environmental Health at the Australian National University. As we speak, I'm attending also a UNEP meeting of authors for the Global Environmental Outlook 7 report. So I'm calling in from Bangkok, Thailand today. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks so much, Sotiris, and it's a great pleasure to be partnering with the wonderful HEAL Network on the development of this planning and then implementation of this webinar today. And now I'm pleased to introduce our roundtable speakers to you, and shortly I'll invite each of them to speak on their perspective of the topic for a few minutes. Once the speakers have all spoken, there is some time allocated for discussion and dialogue between the speakers, and there may be time for questions. So if you have a question, please pop it in the chat. To start our session today will be Alistair Woodward. Alistair is Professor of Epidemiology at the University of Auckland, and today he'll be discussing the health and environment co-benefits of trees and green space. Andrea will follow Alistair, and Andrea Hinwood, she's the Chief Scientist at the United Nations Environment Programme. Andrea will be discussing the science policy interface and providing a global context to today's discussion. Daniel Bennett will come next, and he will be discussing the urban planning perspective. Daniel is a landscape architect and he's president of the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects SA chapter. Our final speaker today will be Brenton Greer. Brenton is director of the Green Adelaide, and Green Adelaide is the South Australian government agency tasked with greening the Greater Adelaide urban area. Brenton will share Green Adelaide's approach to urban greening He'll outline their ambitions, the challenges faced, and suggest some practical way forwards. So why are we so interested in trees and green space? Well, green space, also sometimes referred to as green infrastructure, is becoming an increasingly popular focus for policymakers and researchers as a potential mitigation strategy that can be applied to minimise some of the impacts of climate change. Green space includes areas in the urban environment, importantly, both public and private spaces, and can include things like parks, sports and school ovals, gardens, streetscapes, front and backyards, private areas such as golf courses, and many others. The research evidence on green space and its impact on physical health, mental health, and ecosystem health has increased significantly over years. Trees, beyond their amenity and biodiversity value, and these are important, provide critical services that help make our cities healthier and more livable. So in today's session, we'll be exploring the potential for trees and green space to be a viable strategy that can help to mitigate some of the challenges associated with climate change and simultaneously deliver improvements in population health, wellbeing, and health equity. So now I'd really like to hand over to Alistair and invite Alistair to open today's roundtable discussion. Over to you, Alistair.
Well, look, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I'm Alistair Woodward from the University of Auckland. And I realise I've only got 7 minutes, so I thought I'd put the sort of major messages I wanted to get across on this first slide in case I run out of time. And the 3 points I would like to make is that trees are powerful. They really do have amazing effects on human health. We don't quite know why, and for some people that's a reason to doubt the evidence. I don't think so. And I want to share with you some examples of the evidence, just to make the point that it's really little different to the state of public health science that says smoking's bad for us and physical activity is good for us, But I'd like to end, if possible, just on a note of caution to say that, of course, there are possibilities for trees to do more harm than good. And so we do need to think about the balance and about reasons why. So if I could move to the next slide. So I'm going to give you 3 examples of public health science making the point that trees in different ways, amazing ways really, do have profound effects. This is an example of a natural experiment. The Robert Taylor Homes, it's a project, I think they call it in the United States, a very large public housing project in Chicago, apartments, blocks, as you can see here, spread over 3 miles. And it just happened that some of the apartments had outlooks which are barren, of the kind you can see on the left, and some had outlooks of the kind you can see on the right. Now, the interesting thing is that new residents were allocated to apartment blocks without any regard for the presence or absence of green space. And so this was an opportunity to see whether, after residents had been in the apartments for some time, whether the health varied. The famous study that I'm referring to looked at the effects of trees on mood, and particularly on aggression and violence. And the study reported that those who lived in apartments, who were placed in apartments overlooking green space, were 20 to 30% less likely to exhibit aggressive and violent behavior. And it's very difficult to see any other reason why that should be so, except the fact that they were surrounded by a green environment rather than an environment of the kind you can see on the left. Can I see the next slide, please? Now, if trees are good for you, then one would sort of infer that loss of trees should be bad for you. And this is a famous study looking at the effects of emerald ash borer, which spread through the Midwest of the United States in the 2000s and resulted in the death, I think, of 100 million trees, something like that. And so what the public health scientists did was to look at mortality rates in counties before and after they were affected by the borer, and also making comparisons between counties at the same point in time, which were similar in other respects. And the conclusion was that mortality, human mortality that is, was increased in the period when emerald ash borer was active and trees were lost. Roughly 20,000 excess deaths, it was calculated, occurred in association with, and very likely due to, the loss of trees in those counties affected by emerald ash borer. And then the third slide, just different, but there are a number of these studies now which have sort of in real time attempted to monitor people who are exposed to green space, and particularly trees, to see what happens, sort of physiological sensing of the human response to green space. And here's an example from Philadelphia, where people were wired up and their heart rate was monitored, was measured, and it was observed that when they passed green lots, there was part of a city remediation program, and a number of vacant lots had been treated as green spaces. Their heart rate slowed more than it did when people stopped and viewed vacant lots. This is not inconsistent with other work, and is sort of a piece that adds to the evidence that, as I said, in mysterious but real and very important ways, exposure to nature, and in particular exposure to trees, does affect humans in ways that are beneficial. Can I move to the next slide, which I think is my last one? Yeah, so so far I've made the point that there's very good reason, I believe, to accept the hypothesis, the proposal that trees can be health promoting in many ways, and their effects are quite powerful. But just to finish with a cautionary note, of course, in some circumstances, trees can be hazardous. And this is very much on my mind here in New Zealand, because, of course, the storms and floods that we experienced in January and February not long ago were compounded by this phenomenon of forestry slash. So this is trees planted, particularly in the eastern part of the North Island, on steep slopes on what's called marginal land. And the policy has been of clear felling with no requirement for companies to clean up after them. This is all part of an efficiency drive, and may have made good sense in the past, possibly. But my suggestion is that as times change, and in particular as the climate crisis takes hold, and we experience severe rain events of the kind that have hit New Zealand in the last month, then the previous land use policies really seriously need reviewing. And that includes the question of where we plant trees, what kind of trees, and how we look after them. So that's the points I want to make. Trees are powerful. They can improve health. Very good reason to believe that's the case, even though we're not fully sure on how they do that. But in some occasions, in some circumstances, of course, the wrong trees in the wrong place at the wrong time can cause problems. So we need to be aware of that as well.
Well done, Alistair, for sticking so close to time. I think I really loved the idea that actually there's powerful evidence that trees are a really important resource for us in terms of both our environment and our own human health. But we need to get the balance right in terms of understanding about planting the right trees in the right places and looking after them in the right way. If I flip what you've just said, it's in a positive lens. I'd now like to invite Andrea Hinwood to follow up and have a conversation and to share her thoughts on the science policy interface and share sort of the global context. So thanks, Andrea.
Thanks, Carmel. Thanks, everyone. I'd like to take us up. I'd like to agree with Alistair in terms of trees being powerful, because what we're actually dealing with is a triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity, and pollution. If I can have my next slide. But I want to talk more about nature and biodiversity and the importance and co-benefits that can arise. So you've already heard from Alistair that nature and health, and we're seeing increasing benefits being demonstrated, and particularly in terms of greening in cities, reducing heat, which improves outcomes for health as well. We see significant benefits of nature and biodiversity to the health of the planet in terms of maintenance of biodiversity, preventing spillover for pandemics, etc., which we're still experiencing now. And of course, there are some challenges for us, though, in living in harmony with nature globally. We do appear to be seeing biodiversity loss increasing. We're seeing declines in nature. And unfortunately, we're undermining progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals related to poverty, hunger, health, water, cities, climate, oceans, and land, because there is an interconnection and integration of biodiversity and nature with respect to these Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide, please. So I don't like providing these stats, but I think it's really important to understand that we're using the equivalent of 1.6 Earths to maintain our current way of life, that we're experiencing species extinction, and this is something we want to reverse, that 75% of the Earth's land surface has already been altered by human action, that 66% of ocean areas are impacted by human activities, including fisheries and pollution, which again impact on human health, food security, etc. Close to 90% of the world's marine fish stocks are fully exploited, overexploited, or depleted. And of course, our global food system is the primary driver of biodiversity loss. And with increasing climate change, frequency and intensity of events, these sorts of need for food and for growing more food is potentially putting biodiversity and nature more at risk. So there is a very strong case for maintenance of nature, maintenance of trees, but actually restoring ecosystems as well. So if I can just talk about some of the global actions, and then perhaps we can lead on to some of the positive things that are occurring. Next slide, please. So in December last year, there was actually a breakthrough with the Convention on Biological Diversity, where there is now the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which actually sets out a whole range of targets and actions to address the key drivers of biodiversity loss. Importantly, putting back restoration. So where we've degraded landscapes, we restore them. Where we actually require conservation, that we actually maintain biodiversity and nature. And so the range of actions which countries have signed on to is to actually increase the amount of nature and biodiversity that we currently have, which can only be a good thing for health. There's certainly a lot of initiatives to invest in nature-based solutions, but they do need to triple by 2030. So if we're going to meet a range of targets, then we need to look at how we finance that. And in the context of human health and urban settings, how do we actually use those nature-based solutions to actually address some of these restoration needs, how we actually embrace biodiversity and how we can improve human health, reduce heat, mitigate climate change and adapt to climate change as well, as Alistair also showed in his last slide. We also had the Glasgow Climate Pact, which is a call to action to achieve 1 gigatonne of emissions from forests by 2025, so that's only a couple of years away. We're currently in the decade of ecosystem restoration, and there are numerous countries around the world that are committed to planting trees, and we're talking millions of trees in various locations across the globe. these can only be good things, noting this issue about the right type of trees in the right type of setting so we don't introduce other issues. And of course, greening our cities both helps mitigate climate change and also adapt to climate change, and improves the health of our communities within cities, and hence is a really important facet to actually drive improvements both in terms of planetary health but also the important factor of human health. So Carmel, with that, I'll leave it there, and maybe we can discuss some of these issues more. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Andrea. It's really great to hear that there's so many, there's a number of really critically important global policy commitments to really trying to address some of the crises that you talked about, the biodiversity loss and some of the climate change mitigation strategies. And it will be great to have more conversation as we move through today to kind of explore some of those in more detail. I particularly found it sort of alarming, but also confronting to hear about the fact that the food system is driving, our global food system is driving the loss, the biodiversity loss, and it makes a lot of sense to see how that could really be escalating with challenges to climate change in the next decade. So that we need to be focusing our attention on how to address and halt some of these concerns. And now I'd like to invite Daniel Bennett, who's a landscape architect and the president of the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects SA chapter. He's going to be talking about the urban planning perspective, and he may touch on some of these things that I think a number of you have already addressed. So I'll start your timer.
Thank you. Well, thanks everyone, and what a fabulous series of presentations and intro we've had so far. I just wanted to note that I'm here on the traditional country of the Cammeraygal people here in North Sydney, and I acknowledge my role in authentic reconciliation. I say that with genuine affection for country, and as a landscape architect, I do work on land, off land, and have developed skills in looking at land, but I still have so much to learn. I think we can learn so much from the way our traditional custodians manage the land. So I really want to make that point. It's so important for us to listen to country and learn from it across the world. I take a bit of a pragmatic view to this as a practitioner, and as I think you said, Kamal, I am a change agent. I like that. I'm not sure that I am, but I wanted to talk to you about the value of trees from a cities and a spaces perspective in a climate emergency. Let's not mince words here. We are in one, and we've just heard from Andrea around biodiversity challenges. So just this slide here, I'm a visual thinker, so I don't have too many words. The benefits of greening in our cities are well documented. And note all the previous speakers' comments on trees. They do have an economic benefit, that's proven. They do add to character and identity of our places. The ubiquitousness of plain trees everywhere takes away our inherent value of where we are, for instance, when we use all of one species. They have environmental benefits. Greening does. The health and wellbeing benefits we've touched on in some previous speakers as well. There's an emerging science around the safety aspects from urban heat island impacts. And the ability to walk on hot days, which is increasing, and I'll show you a slide in a sec that shows that even in little old Adelaide. And of course the social benefits of having green spaces to actually socialise and get away from screens like we are today. Next slide, thanks. And again, just some examples of this. This was some work when I was in charge of planning, design and transport and greening at the City of Adelaide. Greening has so many different aspects to it, from complicated green walls to tree planting to having greener streets to food. We've heard a bit about the food and looming food shortages, 1.6 Earths for 1 Earth. Again, where's all the food coming from? And then things like dealing with the impacts of changing climate through water-sensitive urban design measures at a very granular level. These all have a role. Next slide. some of the research that we were doing in advance of this, and one of the big challenges that many cities have, in fact all cities have across the world, is if we pick on trees and greening, as you can see these two graphs here. This is the City of Adelaide's urban heat island maps there, daytime and nighttime. And you can sort of see, for those of you that don't know Adelaide, the CBD is in the bottom and North Adelaide is in the top. It's very hot in the city. Now, some analysis that we did, this was a little while ago, was that we were having 20 odd days on average of days above 35 degrees Celsius. And that's projected back in, this was in 2015, I think, to be 27 more days above 35. So there's 47 days above 35 degrees. That is a long time in a very, very warming climate in a hot city that has already some issues. And so again, it has an impact on our health, as we've heard. Public health, wellbeing, our activity levels, economic activities tends to drop on really hot days. And obviously, of course, our outdoor spaces provide the glue for our sociability in our cities, and that has cultural implications as well. And of course, there is a very strong correlation between the urban heat island effects and the lack of greening. Next slide. And so just to put this in perspective, and often I have been challenged in my career, often, you know, trees are a pain to put in streets. Well, they're one of the few things that appreciate in their value over time as they grow, as they mature, whereas our assets in the asset management world depreciate. And so it's one of the few assets that actually does increase its contribution to our cities and places. Next slide. And so mapping things and measuring things is really important, and mapping change even more so. And again, I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but the CBD of Adelaide in the northwest, which happens to be where our main hospital is and a lot of those health services, is also the hottest part of the city. And so it's a very challenging environment in which to plant trees. So again, mapping and showing where we need to track our effort is really important, especially when we're trying to deal with the impacts of a warming climate, as well as some of these other challenges that we've heard from previous speakers. Next slide. And what our research found when we just looked at the city's street trees, we realised that 3 species make up 60% of the street trees in the City of Adelaide, which is a huge climate risk in terms of disease and adaptability. And it wasn't even the plane tree that held the value of the most prominent tree. It's the hackberry tree. And so I guess they're beautiful smaller trees, but we have 28% of them. And so when we're looking at how we want to plan for change, we need to understand where we are and where we've come from. And so again, this was a very useful exercise for us to go, actually, we need to rethink. Whatever's easiest isn't always necessarily the best. And what's that old saying? The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today, but it is the right tree in the right place for the right reason. Next slide. So what we worked through, and in consultation with my colleagues at the time in the sustainability and climate change area, was we thought, well, what's a benchmark for a maximum amount of a particular species? And so as part of our Green City plan at the time, we made it 10%. So our aim is to get no more than 10% of a single species in what is a very harsh environment, a streetscape in the middle of a city, to reduce that prevalence of 3 species, or 60% of the streets, city street trees, actually creating that climate risk. So what does all that mean? Next slide. Trees matter. As things change, whether we get colder, hotter, wetter, drier, trees matter. They have so much more to offer the way we live and adapt ourselves. Even more important is in our warmer climes is to have those trees connecting at maturity. Because on hot days, it can reduce that ambient temperature under the tree by 10 to 20 degrees Celsius. And I'm sure we've seen plenty of examples of that. We saw some earlier. This also reduces our dependency on motorised or combustion engine vehicles to move around, even electric engine. It reduces the carbon dependency by making places comfortable to walk when it's hot. It also leads to behaviour change, which again is something we must tackle. Tracking it is really important regardless of scale, so that we can see where we're going, where we're coming, how we're losing. And this is a real issue, again, around the world as we intensify our cities. Importantly, and the hardest part for anyone in local and state government and federal governments is to target the hard places, not the easy ones, because the hard ones are where these are the areas that suffer the most. And so having a positive approach to tackling the hardest places in our cities is something I'm really passionate about, and really, as Brenton knows, I'm working really hard on. Increasing the species diversity I've talked about, which not only helps potentially bridge some gaps of reconciliation in terms of country and First Nations, it improves biodiversity genuinely by providing places for animals and plants to live, which we need as part of our ecosystem services. And lastly,
and you're at the end of your time. I know,
one last thing was just, like all living things, trees need care. They're like us. They're humans. They need love and attention. Thank you.
Thanks so much, and sorry to interrupt, but just need to feel them. Yeah, it needs to kind of be balanced. So thank you. And again, I think you raised a lot of really great points, and I think the adage that the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, and if not then the second best time is now, is a really sort of lovely concept to be thinking about. And also, I was shocked at the lack of diversity in the City of Adelaide. I spend a lot of my time in the City of Adelaide for work, and I wouldn't have come up with that assessment. So it's really interesting, as you say, monitoring is so important. And now I'd like to move forward to our last speaker. I'd like to invite Brenton to talk about Green Adelaide and to share with us Green Adelaide's plans for trying to strengthen the urban greening and our environment in the city. Over to you, Brenton.
Thank you, Carmel, and thank you to the other speakers. So Green Adelaide is a metropolitan-focused landscape board, or another way, we're an urban natural resources management board, and we're actually the first legislated NRM board for a capital city. So we know that, and we know we want to be an example of great plans and great actions to do these things. Our board's got a vision of cooler, greener, wilder, and that actually does encapsulate pretty well what we do. We work very closely, and we're proud of our partnership with the Kaurna people of Adelaide. And you can see there is a pictogram that Alan Sumner put together for us, a Kaurna man, that's depicting our 7 legislative priorities. I won't go into them, but if you look deeply, you'll see those 7 priorities. And the role of Green Adelaide is to do many things in various ways. So we engage, we inspire, we innovate, we undertake planning, we develop policy, we fund, we educate, we regulate. So there's we don't do all those things in every individual element, but we do those things across many elements. Next slide, thank you. So in terms of greening the city, the Parliament of South Australia has tasked Green Adelaide with leading this development of a urban greening strategy, and we've been working on that for the last year and talking to a lot of people. And the reason of doing that is to accelerate greening in Adelaide. There are many, I guess, they're wicked problems that need to be addressed if we're going to accelerate greening and meet our targets for urban greening in Adelaide. And so this strategy is about that. We've been talking with many people. We know that practical on-ground people involved in greening, the technical community involved in urban greening, researchers, policy developers, key stakeholders. We've been talking to all those people, and we're well into developing the urban greening strategy. And we're pretty confident that this strategy will be able to address and lead a number of actions. Next slide. So the things that the strategy are going to do, it's not going to do everything, but it will try at least at a high level bridge all of the issues that are there in terms of greening our city. Look, in terms of filling known gaps or scaling up what's working well, as an example, It's the urban heat and tree canopy work that's underway at the moment. Pieces of that have been done, and Daniel showed one of those for the City of Adelaide. Green Adelaide's worked with councils and other stakeholders and is just about to release that data set and that mapping for the whole city. There are these metropolitan, Adelaide-wide benefits that would be able to be harnessed, and I would put in that list planning reform, a really key aspect that needs to be addressed if we're going to have a greener city, and that includes the way we deal with individual tree species, but also biodiversity sensitive urban design and providing guidance metropolitan-wide about how people can take up that. And then obviously cross-sector collaboration and getting co-investment. And some of the areas there would be the improvement of our plant selector tools and things like street tree selection trials and development. So it's not about business as usual, it's about working on new things or scaling up those things that currently exist. And that strategy is going to help us be able to do that. Next slide, thanks. So just some of those key areas for action. So as I alluded to, strengthening government policy and tree protection laws, and the expert panel on planning reforms coming out soon, and I think we will complement that nicely. Leading by example in public infrastructure projects, things like the developments at Breakout Creek, major transport corridors, but also involving Aboriginal people and their particular knowledge around land management. Shifting behaviours, inspiring the community to love trees, and the National Park City movement is one of those. Supporting better decisions by getting evidence and research, and we just want the applied research pipeline is something we want to improve. And building capability and coordinating and co-investment. And that's, we want to develop, and there will be a coordinated framework about how this will be delivered and demonstrating the progress that we're making. So that's mapping tools, data collection, the right indicators, and reporting. Next slide, please. So finally, just some quick wins that are happening at the moment as we develop the urban greening strategy. And not everything that Green Adelaide does in this area is encapsulated in the greening strategy, but many things are. In terms of the current round of planning improvements, there was a need for an Adelaide garden guide for new homes. So those people who now are developing allotments, how do they put 1 tree, 2 trees, 3 trees, the size of trees, have more, and what do they do with their soft space, soft ground? Well, this garden guide has been well accepted by the development community and homeowners themselves. I mentioned before, we have underway urban heat and tree canopy data recapture and all the tools that come with that, developing up water sensitive urban design codes and guidelines for the planning system. And we have out there now Cooler, Greener, Wilder grants accessible by local government to actually partner and deliver these things on ground. And what's ahead, refreshing the plant selector is going to be something very useful for both councils and developers and home gardeners. Working out greening prioritisation, so including tree canopy, urban heat and socio-demographic data to actually work out where do we need to prioritise our greening efforts. And then just building up the capacity and the capability that it's not all about tree canopy, it's about the whole structure of the urban forest, and that includes implementing biodiversity sensitive urban design. And with that, I think my time is up, Carmel, and hand back to you.
Thanks so much, Brenton. And all of the 4 speakers have really covered, I think, the topic in quite a lot of depth in quite a brief period of time. And it's really pleasing to see both at the global level some of the really important policy positions and also here in our state in South Australia and Adelaide, some really kind of policy directions that support action. And I guess it will be great to see all of these actions kind of delivered on. I'm now going to pose, I'd like to, no, we're not moving to Sortia's yet. I'd like to just pose one question to all of our speakers. I think we have time. And I think really I want to kind of to focus on, for all of our speakers, that despite the clear benefits provided by trees and green space for people and planet, that globally and locally we're losing trees and green space at an accelerating rate. And this is despite many governments having the policy priorities and targets in place, as we've already heard about today. I'd like to know, what more do you think needs to be done to halt the loss of trees and green space? Can I open it to any of my speakers to start that question?
Carmel, I would like to start. I'm very interested in what Daniel and Brenton might have to say about this, but in the city that I live in, Auckland, you know, most green space, most tree cover is actually on private land.
Mm.
And one of the issues we face is the great need for more housing and the tendency for the city to become denser, for settlement to be more intense. And there are many good things about that, but it is coming with the loss of tree cover, particularly in the older suburbs where blocks are being cleared for multiple dwellings. So I'd be interested in how we manage to intensify better so that we protect tree cover and ideally increase it rather than lose it.
I'm happy to have a crack, but I'm sure Brenton will cover this as well. It's a really good good question to ask, and Alistair, I concur. I think it's as Adelaide as an example, the middle ring suburbs, the private greening loss is probably our biggest concern at the moment because of that intensification, and that's just part of our cities developing and changing, especially middle cities like Adelaide in Australia and perhaps even Auckland. I'm not sure. I think what is happening is that perhaps, again, Brenton may offer a different view, but what we're seeing is a little bit of an erosion of some of the protection that is for existing trees, which can be dealt with quite easily. And it's the will of the, I guess, legislators to enact that. We used to have some of Australia's best tree protection legislation. We still do, but many other jurisdictions have improved in terms of the trees. And Brenton mentioned the tree plant, or the greening guide for homes is a really, really, really good step. But the protection for those big trees is simply not there. And there are exemptions and offsets that you can do, and that's fine. But I guess if the question is around tree loss in our suburbs, that's one of the reasons why is there something's got to give, and trees are the things that are giving at the moment.
So just to follow on from Daniel, definitely, Alistair, urban consolidation is just as big a problem in Adelaide. There was a first round of planning reforms to try and improve the urban form, and so requiring more soft space, requiring trees on properties. But that's the private land. The public land, the streetscape, also needs a whole lot of innovation, and not just the streetscapes, our urban parks as well. And so the term quality green open space, so investing more in that. But certainly for the community to accept there's a new urban form rather than perhaps what we've got used to in the middle suburbs over the years. But community attitudes, I think, are also a big part of this as well. That there does still seem to be a fear of trees and a lack of appreciation of not just trees, but the understory that's required to create a better biodiverse environment. So planning reform, tree regulation, changing community attitudes are all things to halt the tree decline.
Can I ask whether Sortius or Andrea would like to make a comment to that? In particular, Andrea, I guess I'd be interested to hear what you think the issue is at a global level.
Well, I was actually reflecting on living here in Kenya because, interestingly, the same issues are affecting a place like Nairobi, where there is a demand for housing. Areas are just being cleared There isn't an attention to what I would call livability principles in land use planning, where, you know, you can have some intensification of development, but it's not livable. People are not walking around because you've just got now these big massive roads, Chick Bajal with big developments. All of the trees are being removed, and it's interesting because my Kenyan colleagues are noticing exactly the same thing. And then, you know, from my experience in Australia, I would say it is also about land use planning, that we actually need to accept a higher level of housing stock, not the big house on the quarter-acre block, which I think is still part of the psyche in Australia, at least from where I come from. And so I do think that we need, I agree with Brenton and Daniel and Alistair, that we need that awareness of the link between humans and nature and the need for biodiversity and nature within our urban developments. We need our policymakers and regulators to actually implement the laws they've actually got in place. We've got some good legislation and some good things that we can implement, but we're not implementing it. And then we need some behaviour change with our developers, is my view, in that we don't just have the development costs. We need to factor in what the environmental implications might be of not developing in a sensitive way that actually will benefit us all. Thanks, Carmel.
Thanks so much, Andrea. Matthias, did you want to make a comment?
Thanks, Carmel. A fascinating discussion, and I cannot help thinking about other parts of the world where environmental legislation and perceptions are very different. So, like here in Bangkok, where I'm calling from today, or in Athens, Greece, the place where I grew up, and there is huge pressure for private development, and you know, in big cities, land has been cleared over many years to build high-rising buildings, and I think there's only a lack of appreciation of the ecosystem services that trees can provide. I suppose maybe perceptions and you know, there's a change in this as well in the urban population. But certainly there is much less protection for green space, and where there is green space is often quite often very neglected. You know, and I'm reflecting on what Daniel was saying earlier. You know, that trees need love and attention. You know, sometimes we love them, but we don't pay enough attention, and they need investment. They don't come for free. There is investment in maintenance. And I think that's very, very important. It's an investment in the livability of a city, investment in health and well-being of the urban citizens, and of course this has to come from citizens, but also from the state and the regulators.
Thanks, Matthias. That's great. Now, we probably have time for one question from the participants. And actually, Brenton, it's directed at you. They would like you to elaborate on the plant selector refresh, about what's planned for that in relation to climate change considerations.
Yeah, so it is to take into account what we know is going to happen with the climate in Adelaide, and acknowledge that the list of species that we have got have to be available by the horticultural industry so that developers and home gardeners can purchase those, but also to be a little more, the ability to be a little more focused on whatever geographical area you're in. So it actually gives you a better recommendation of the type of tree for your particular soil type, your subclimate, and so on. So that's to make it a better tool.
Great, thanks. Now, I'd like to finish with one question to all of the participants, and then we'll invite Sotiris to wind up and give us a reflection on the discussion overall. But I think it'd be good to hear from all of you. What do you think we as global citizens and local community members can do to really address the loss of green space and biodiversity and reverse this trend? How do we go about improving the livability of our communities and our globe? Andrew, maybe I'll go to you first.
So clearly, really good land use planning. I think all of the tools are actually available. It's putting them in place for good and appropriate land use planning. And where you already have poor planning, and we have lots of examples, then it's about how you restore those urban environments. And from the sector that are dealing with livability, there are some fantastic examples of renewal of urban environments that are just concrete jungles, and there are some lovely examples. So I would encourage anyone who's listening to go and look for those examples of how the renewal of those particular areas has then resulted with more community interaction, for increased safety, for a whole range of other co-benefits. And of course, all of those things improve mitigation and adaptation to climate change, improve our health and the environment more generally. So whatever we do is going to be positive, but I'd certainly be looking at those spaces and value nature and biodiversity, and then look at how we actually live in cities and consider that livability aspect. Thanks,
you.
Carmel.
Did anybody else want to comment on that question?
I'm happy to, Carmel. I think great words, Andrea. I just want to reflect that one positive thing that's come out of the pandemic, and for those of us lucky enough, I mean, I speak as a privileged person living in a rich country, is that we've learnt to love where we live or not, and that's based on what's around us. And so my advice is that we start with we're anthropic creatures, right? We think about ourselves first, our health and well-being. So start there, start at home, start at the kids' school or at your office, and look at things a bit differently. When we were staring at four walls during COVID, I was lucky to be able to look out on my garden, plant a tree, go to the effort of getting your hands dirty, because it's so enriching, and it really does tap into something deep within us, I think. And that's where my reflection on country and learning more from our traditional owners. They can teach us so much. So start at home is my advice.
And Carmel, I'd just add one little thing to that. Now, Adelaide is a national park city, only one of two, and we hope more join the family soon. But there is that thing about everyone, everywhere, every day, and that just means connecting with nature in your city. You're aware of it, you love it, and it might make a difference. And whether that's looking after your verge, looking after your balcony, or changing policy and legislation, it incites action.
Oh, I love that. I haven't caught up with that. Everyone, everywhere, every day. Oh, that's a lovely statement. And Alistair, would you like to have a final word before we hand over to Sotiris to provide a raconteur session?
Well, again, I'm commenting from Auckland, and it may well be different in Adelaide, but about 70% of our public land in the city is devoted to looking after cars, roads, car parks, and we do green space very badly on our roads. So I think a really important challenge for us is to do a better job of bringing the green world, the natural world, into our transport system, and that might well mean that we have fewer cars.
I think probably many of us that on this call would probably agree with that. So that's lovely that you've mentioned that. Thanks so much. Now, Sotiris, can I please invite you to provide the kind of summary raconteur session before we wind up today's webinar? Over to you.
Thank you, Carmel. What a fascinating discussion today about trees, the environment, and health and health and well-being. I feel that I learned a lot. There are many technical aspects to urban trees and tree planting and the right type of species. But I think the bottom line is about connecting with nature and what was mentioned just now, that during the COVID-19, what really made a difference for people was to be able to connect to nature, have a walk, or look out of the window and see a green space or a tree. I was lucky enough to be in Canberra at the time, you know, the bush capital, very green space, and I had very easy daily access to green space, which was not the case when I was living in Athens, Greece, where I grew up in a very dense city, very car orientated, and with very little green space. And I remember waking up every morning and staring at the single tree that I could see outside my window. So I think there's something to be said about health and well-being, and especially mental health, and the presence of green space in cities. I think there is plenty to learn from the traditional custodians of the lands of Australia, or other indigenous cultures and knowledge systems. Connecting with language, connecting with country, connecting with nature is absolutely essential for our health and well-being. And it's not an investment only; it's a necessity. And there's so much to. So many co-benefits in terms of carbon sequestration, better air quality, opportunities for physical activity and amenity, social connections, shading, mitigating urban heat islands. There are so many co-benefits of green space and trees in cities. Of course, there are a number of caveats as well, as Alistair mentioned. We need to get the right type of species and the right type of canopy, tree canopy design. But overall, I think the key message is that we need to invest. We need to love trees and pay them due attention.
Thanks so much, Sortius. So I think we've done quite well, even though we started a little late because we had some technical issues. But I think we finished on time, which is lovely. So I'd sort of like to thank all of our speakers for the great conversation and discussion we've had today. And I suppose the key messages that I've taken away from today's session, on top of what Sortius said, is really the critical role that urban planning plays, and the important role that we're hoping that our legislators and regulators can also deliver in supporting and helping us protect and regenerate those areas where we have lost trees. But the other kind of critical area that I think we've talked about today, which was really pleasing to hear, is really the role of us as community members and citizens, and engaging with community and getting communities around the world to love the places they live, and if they don't love the places they live, how they can lobby and advocate for those places to be regenerated, and then to support those regenerated areas and care for them, and be engaged in the process of maintaining the green spaces in their local communities and our cities. So it's a mixture of requiring government, the state and the community, and then the private sector. And we haven't talked a lot about the private sector today, but the role of the private sector is obviously very critical, and we need to be, engaging them in these conversations and encouraging them to take on, the actions that are required. But with that, I'd like to sort of close our session today. Sortius and I, as the co-host of the session, really want to thank all of our speakers for their time and their insightful comments. We'd like to thank all of you for joining us on this conversation today. And just to let you know that we'll be editing this webinar, and then we'll be posting the final edited version up onto the Chatpriot YouTube channel, and we'll be circulating it to all of our guest speakers today for them to post it on their websites if they see fit. We'll also be summarising the key messages we'll be summarising the key messages from today's conversation into a policy brief that'll be published in a relevant journal. And we're in negotiations with a number of journals that are very keen to have this policy brief, which will capture the insights from today's conversations. But with that, I'd just like to make one more last thank. I would like to thank my lovely colleagues, Samaya and Neha, who have been the backbone of organising today's session and who've helped navigate the technical glitches that we've had, particularly Neha. So thank you so much for your support for today. I really appreciate it.